Dobrý den. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. I know it's difficult before the semester begins, so thank you for taking the time to come. My name is Sarah Leupen. Some of you I know from when I was a Fulbright scholar here from September 2016 until June 2017. And this morning I came back to your beautiful country, so I'm happy to talk to you. And what Milena Kralichkova asked me to talk about was metacognitive and reflective practices. So the first thing I need to tell you is, what do I mean? What are these things? And then why are they important? So first, just a couple of definitions. My little thing's not changing. So by metacognition, it's the skill of thinking about your own thinking. And the reflection is similar, and I don't really think it's important to be clear on the distinction, but reflects more your feelings and experiences than just your thinking. And so I'm going to give really like 3 examples of metacognition and 2 of reflection as far as, or categories of examples of things we can use. And if you decide you want to read more about this, this book is a good reference, and I'll give that reference again at the end along with some other references that are useful. Okay, why do we care about these things? I'm sure you've had the experience that your students may be reasonably good at learning what you want to teach them at a surface level. They can name the facts that you want them to name, they can make a list, they can identify things, but they don't have a very deep understanding, or they struggle with the type of understanding, the deeper understanding that you want them to have. And there's many reasons for this. But one of the reasons, and the one we're going to focus on today, is that students don't even recognize that there is a difference between surface and deep understanding. And because of this, students are generally poor, and by students I don't mean just our students, but even us when we're learning a new thing. It's just humans, really. As we learn a new thing, we don't have any ability to distinguish between good understanding and limited or surface understanding. And the way you can find this out with your own students, I recommend trying this, is when your students have an exam or any sort of assessment that you give them, as they're leaving the room, ask them, how well did you do on this assessment? It's a very interesting and fun game, because if you think of like a percentage, I would say 90% of your students will say some number between 80 and 90%. In other words, they all think they did quite well, not perfect, but quite well. And of course, some of them probably did do well. But even the ones that did badly probably think that they did well. They can't recognize the fact that they don't have good understanding. This has been investigated by many different people, but the most famous one is a psychology study by Dunning and Kruger, where they taught some students formal logic, and they gave them a test, and they asked the students to predict their performance. And the black line is the predicted performance as when they just divided up the exam scores into the highest and second and third and fourth quartile. And as you can see, the students had a wide range of actual performance, but they all thought that they did, you know, about a B level of performance or 80% level performance. So the very best students actually underestimated their performance. But there's a huge gap here, right? How could these students think that they had done so well? But if you do this with your own students, you'll see that you get the same result. These two went farther, and they said, well, why is this? You know, what explains this gap? And so they did some more work with the students and showed them here is a real, so this particular test was in formal logic. They had taught them some formal logic. And after the test, then they went back and said, here's a really good example of an answer to this question. Now, how do you think you did? And the students on the right half of the distribution corrected their impression. They said, oh, okay, I see that that's better answer than mine. But these students had no ability to even recognize a higher quality answer as being higher quality. So this is now, the paper's name is at the top here, and this has now become a meme on the internet of being too incompetent to realize how incompetent you are. And really, we all face this in whatever area we're learning, that it's hard to estimate our own competence. So how can we address this? You know, how can we help students come to a deeper understanding? Well, I'm going to give you some examples of that, but first I want you to consider a question, and I'm going to have you vote on it with my beautiful cards. So discuss it with the person sitting next to you. If you're not sitting next to anyone, join someone and discuss it with them. All right, so choose with your teammate or teammates. Don't hold it up yet. I'm going to count down, but choose the card you think is the best. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Show your answer. You got A's and E's. You have to do it at the same time. They influenced you between that. So A was the most popular answer here, and then E, another choice. What did you guys choose? A? A. Oh, and tell us why you chose A.
We put out the other possibilities because we also think that they are important, but they are less important than A.
Than having that intention.
Having an individual desire to learn the problem.
The desire and the motivation? Did you guys have the same reason for your choice or something?
Pretty much. I mean, we were deciding between A and D maybe.
Okay.
D also seemed kind of important, but then we decided on A because like mutual opinion of all people.
Similar reasoning or?
Yeah. In a way, D doesn't feel really like this is something overappreciated or overestimated.
You believe it's overappreciated?
Yeah.
You're right. There's actually not very much evidence that D is true. It's very popular to talk about it, but it's very not. Popular, but it's humans all learn pretty similarly, actually. So, visual species. You guys had 2 choices, even though it says the most important.
We are quite discussing it's almost the same because if you have an intention and like the motivation, you usually think about the.
So the more motivation you have, you would think differently or more?
Yeah, I think
both. About that. Okay, well, let me show you a study, and then we'll come back to this question. I really like this study. In this study, they took some US university students, and they gave them something to learn. And it was about the Crimean War. And they said, learn this information, all right? And then for half of them, they said, you guys are going to take a test about the Crimean War. And for this half of the room, they said, you guys are going to have to teach about the Crimean War and to others. All right? And of course, like most psychology studies, they were lying. And actually, everyone just took a test. All right? All of the participants in the study took a test. Now, I think this is really, you already know where this is going, right? But I think this is interesting because the ones who thought they were going to take a test should have been preparing ideally for this test because they had the right information, right? They knew there was going to be a test and they were right. So we would predict that the students who thought there were going to be a test should do better because they were getting what they expected rather than something different. But you know that's not going to happen, right? So here's the results. It's a whole would say grade level higher, a whole letter grade higher in the American grading system, for those who expected to teach. The students who expected to teach did much better. Now, the study went into this. I don't have time today, but we know from the study, and because we can think, right, that these individuals did better. Why would you say they did better on the test?
Because they had to understand
Right.
material so they could teach it then.
Right. They weren't learning it at that surface level because they knew they had to explain it to themselves so they could explain it to other people thinking about teaching. I find this fascinating because it means that students study for tests incorrectly, right? They could have studied whatever those people did. These people could have done that, but they didn't. And the same thing is happening with our students. They study the surface, and then on the exam, sometimes we ask them to understand, and they don't. Or not always, sometimes they do, but often they don't. So if we go back to this question then, probably there's no difference in their intention to learn. In fact, I would say among my students, they all intend to learn. They all want to learn about physiology when I teach them because they want to go to medical school and do well on the exams, and they think it's interesting. They have that intention, but they're not going about it correctly. Probably they're paying close attention to the material. We already pointed out that D wasn't really true. Time doesn't hurt, but in this study, the time was the same, so that was controlled for. Probably what was different, and then some follow-up work on that study showed this, was that they were thinking about that material differently. They were thinking about it, as you said, to understand it and to explain it. So what our students do while they're studying, and in particular, if they're studying using active methods of reconstructing the material, summarizing it for themselves, asking themselves questions, when they do that, they learn at a deeper level. Many of our students, I think, would be willing to do this. They have the intention, but they don't know that they should do something besides read the book and read it again. To do this is something that is mostly unfamiliar to them to do that. So here's a thing we can teach our students. Have any of you seen this before? I know some of you have seen it. A few. Have any of you ever taught your students about this?
Some of the English textbooks actually include the Bloom's taxonomy before we start with the sessions or before we start with books. So they make them aware what kind of principles rule the process of teaching.
What kind of textbooks are these?
Unlock academic English.
Okay. How about, that's really interesting. I think
this
is
exception.
Just those, yeah, most books don't, but those books do. I think this is changing, actually. I was once talking about this at dinner with my family, and my children, who are 12, knew what their teachers had taught them about it, so maybe it's happening now. So this is a way to structure, it's a way of thinking about our levels of understanding, and the reason it's built like a pyramid is that you can't do any analyzing unless you already have the baseline levels. So students tend to study here, and they don't realize that there's any other way of studying or that we want them to be able to do these higher level things. There's actually lots of resources in Czech about this way of thinking about levels of understanding as well. So you can study this in English or in Czech or obviously many other languages as well. So I want to show you a study where that's what they did. So I guess my first recommendation to you would be to consider telling your students about these levels of understanding, because it might seem obvious to us, but for many of our students, when you say learn this, they just think memorize these words. And so showing them the level is something useful to do. I want to show you a study where they did that. This is in a chemistry class in a Southern American university. And so what they did was they weighted, typical American science classes have like 4 exams, maybe 3. across the 4-month semester. So they waited until after the first exam, because then the students were concerned. Because initially, everyone thinks they do very well, but once they find out that they're not learning as much, they're a captive audience. They used an entire class period, so an hour's class, to teach students some ways of studying at these higher levels. And there's lots of resources on that if you want some after this. They used that entire class period, and they also went back to that first exam that the students had just taken and said, look, this question was at this level, and this question was at that level. So the students would get the idea of how they were being tested. Otherwise, at least in the US, if you ask students questions like this, they say they're trick questions, meaning you didn't just ask me for the facts. And then they told them some ways to study as well. And here's the result from this study. So these 2 years were before they had, control years, before they had done the intervention. And then the blue is the results. So that was the first exam, and then they did the intervention. And then the second and third exams, instead of being the same or a little worse in terms of the percentage performance of the students, actually improved. So it seemed to be useful, at least for these chemistry students, to get the idea of learning how to study at these different levels. So that's one thing we can do, is just tell students about these techniques. By the way, the slides that they showed these students where they taught them about all this stuff are freely available online. So that's I can share these slides afterwards with you guys, and if you want the link, you can go there. And then the lead author of that work, or the senior author of that work, has written a book that's quite useful. And then there's actually now, late 2017, a student version came out called Teach Yourself How to Learn. So that also has become popular in some places. Another way to bring this idea of thinking about your own thinking into to your students is to add it to an assignment. So instead of just telling students, I want you to do this, say, I want you to do this, and I want you to think about how you're figuring it out, how you're learning to solve this problem. So they took something they had already, a task they had already given the students, this is in a biology class, and said, now what I want you to do is not just solve this problem, but describe a strategy for doing that, describe how you figured it out, be able to answer another question without our help, the way you're getting it now for this first one, and even assess how well, what are the strengths and weaknesses of your own approach to solving the problem. And then they gave them the problem itself, which in this case I think was about the inheritance of magic in the Harry Potter families. And they had to figure out the pedigree, as is often done in introductory biology courses. And then after they did this, they had a kind of post set of questions where they said, how did you figure this out? Was there more than one way to get to a good answer? That itself is an insight for students to realize that there's not just one way to do that. And then they asked them about the Bloom's levels. You know, at what level were you thinking for that? When they added this exercise to this pedigree problem that they already had, they found the students didn't learn anything more about biology. In other words, their factual knowledge of biology was not any different. P-value 0.19 here, no change. But their critical thinking ability, which was the goal of the whole exercise, went up by 10%-ish, significantly in those students. So they were able to train them to do better at critical thinking, to do a better job of solving this kind of problem. All the students had seen this kind of problem, but only some of them had those metacognitive training and became better at those types of problems. So that's one way, or I guess it's the second way, to get something into your class. Something else that's really easy to do is to use these things called learning wrappers. It's a pretty small investment. There has to be something your students do repeatedly, whether it's there's multiple exams in the course or there's multiple case studies they're doing or papers they're writing or something. Because what happens normally when students do these is that they do the same thing over and over again. They prepare for one, they take it, they prepare for the next one in the same way, even if they weren't that satisfied with their original performance, because they don't know what to change. Or they think, I just need to study harder. That's what they'll say, I study harder. It doesn't really mean anything, they need to study differently. So without reflection, they tend to do the same thing over and over again. So we're trying to get them to change their behavior. There's different ways to do this. I'm going to give you an example from exams. So this is one in a physics class where after the exam, they ask the students, well, what did you do when you were studying? Were you reading? Were you practicing problems? Were you reviewing your notes? And so on. So they asked them to do that. And then they asked them, why did you, look at the questions you got wrong. Why did you get them wrong? Did you get them wrong because you were messing up the vector notation, or because you made arithmetic errors, or that you didn't understand the concept? It's amazing how little students normally do this. That is, they just normally don't think about what kind of questions did I miss, and how could I fix that. So it gives us this idea that there's a relationship between how they studied and the kinds of mistakes that they made. And typically, if these are longer, it asks them how they'll change their behavior and so on. The ones that I give go on to talk about that as well. This is a cool study of these exam wrappers. So this is before they did the exam wrappers. They asked the students to estimate their scores on the exams. And so each of the three colors, overestimated, correctly, and under, adds up to 100. So all the students that did badly basically overestimated their performance on the exams. And then gradually they get better. The better their understanding is, the better their understanding of their understanding is. And this, I just think this is interesting because it's exactly the same thing that Dunning and Kruger found 20 years ago. But it's still something that's, this is a quite new paper, 2017, in a nutrition course. So the students had a metacognition problem. They weren't good at estimating. And what they did was simply add these exam wrappers to each of these exams. And gradually they saw some changes in the student behavior. And I don't want to show all the figures from the paper because we don't have all day to discuss just this paper. But for example, they found that students shifted how much earlier than the exam they started studying. So their behavior changed once they added the exam wrappers. You had more students starting to study for an exam well ahead of time, and fewer students who studied just the night before or 2 days before the exam. They also saw other changes in behavior in terms of how the students were studying. But in terms of the spreading out of that behavior, they also saw that happening. I also use them in my biophysiology courses, and I find that students just have good suggestions. So on the back of mine, I say, what are you going to do differently for the next exam? And you can see, well, it's hard to read, I think, these students' handwriting, but it says, go over more concept-based things instead of just memorization. Study with a group. That's a good idea in most cases. Practice hypothetical situations, because often I'll ask my students, well, what would happen to these hormone levels if I injected you with this hormone, and so on. And they hadn't thought, they don't know how to think about those. They just memorize the function of each hormone. This one, again, begin studying sooner. Try to teach someone the learning goals, and so on. So they actually seem to, I haven't done a study of these in my class, but they seem to take it seriously and to really think about how they're going to change. I collect these and then I give them back to the students right before the next exam so they remember what they told themselves they were going to do. If all those things sound like they're too much work, just tell your students to go watch the videos by this psychologist because he explains, and this is worth you watching, I think, too. They're very short. And he explains this idea of metacognition and explains to students how to study more metacognitively, where they're thinking about their understanding as they study. If you want it to be extra amusing, you can turn on the Czech subtitles. I'm sure they're terrible because they're automatically generated subtitles. You always have that available as well. I have the link in here, but if you just search for this guy, you'll see, it'll come up easily because his videos have, see, this one has over 1 million views. So it comes up easily because of its popularity on YouTube. Okay, let's do our next question here. What is it that we should tell our students to do when they're studying? So discuss with your table mates, your teammates. All right. So choose a card, but don't hold it up yet. You have to pick one this time, guys, okay? Single most. 3, 2, 1, vote. All agree that the best way, or at least you think, I think the best way, is to teach someone else. Now, maybe there's not a single answer for every possible thing that we would study. But there's certainly so much evidence out there for C that it's very worth mentioning to your students. They just probably don't know. Most teachers don't know, even though they know themselves when they prepare a lecture that they learn a lot. You know, if you've ever prepared a lecture about something that you weren't really an expert in, that you learned a lot when you were preparing it. And even if you were, you might have prepared a lot. And there's a lot of evidence for this. I'm just going to show you one study because I want to talk about a couple other things before our time runs out. But if you want more studies about this, I can send you some. So this is a really well-controlled study where they had 2 sections of the same class. So taught at different times a day, but the same class. Same person taught them. It was during the same semester, so there wasn't any other confounding factors there. The students had the same book to read. They received the same lectures and so on. The tests were the same. The only thing that was different is that during class, when they would interrupt the lecture to ask a question, like I just did, they either did it where the student would think about it and then vote with their little clicker, the little, or their phone. Sometimes you can do it with phones now. Or they had them talk about it with each other and then vote. So that was the only difference in the 2 groups. If you just look at these lower level Bloom questions, so then if you ask these students, what do you know about the basics of this field, there wasn't any difference. There was no effect of teaching each other. But for the questions that were at the higher Bloom's level, on every single exam, if there had been the discussion with other students, the students did better on the higher Bloom's level questions on the exam. Remember, the questions they were asked in class were exactly the same. It's not that they were asked higher level questions in class, it's just that they got to talk about them with each other. And actually, the effect gets bigger as the semester goes on, as if perhaps they're getting better at having these conversations. Now we can ask, why is this? And that's really a whole other talk. But to sum up, it seems that when you talk to someone else, it helps you realize the errors in your own thinking. And we probably know this if you've ever tried to explain, if somebody's like, can you explain Brexit? And you're like, oh yeah, and you start explaining it and you realize you don't completely understand it, right? As you're explaining it. And so that seems to, there's some more work that suggests that this is probably what's happening here. This is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the literature support for showing that in whatever situation you can get students teaching each other, they're going to learn more. Both the student who is leading and the student who is being taught for a variety of reasons. These are all my students working together in class, and the reason I put that up there is I want to emphasize that my students love this. They love being asked to work together, because we often say, oh, I don't want to do that, students hate it. The thing that students hate is if you put them in a group and you say, write me an essay, or take this test together, and you're all going to get the same grade. And then they hate that, because then they're responsible for everyone else, and other people are pulling down their performance, and so on. They hate that. But if you just put them, not in a performance that you're assessing, but just in class, let's talk about this and vote, they really do a great job. And in some cases, they do a better job of explaining things to each other than I could do. And if you listen to your students talk, you'll hear this. And the reason is this zone of proximal development thing where I just don't remember anymore why learning about the action potential is hard. I don't know why that happened. Right? So I just don't, it doesn't seem hard to me. It doesn't seem like something that's difficult to do, but the students in the class remember that it was difficult, and they remember why it was difficult, because they just learned it. They just figured it out, and they can explain it to each other. You still need to be there. You shouldn't tell your students to work and then leave the room and get a coffee, right? You still have to be there. You're still the expert, but having them work together is something that they really value. Okay, so these are really some metacognitive things we could do, and I want to spend the rest of the time thinking about reflection, so kind of going beyond metacognition into thinking about your own experiences and behavior. A lot of people would argue that we've lost our natural times for reflection, that we used to have times when we were walking and thinking, or waiting for a friend and thinking, or waiting for the doctor and thinking, and now we just have our phones. So we don't have those times anymore to reflect. And part of what we can teach students, and I'll get to this at the end, is to know how to reflect, what that is. And we've lost it too. We make fun of students for doing this, but we ourselves are constantly doing multiple things at once and not really setting a good example for our students if this is us behind the instructor's desk doing so many different things. So I think we can tell our students directly, one thing we can tell them is, look, this actually is a lie, all right? That what this person is doing isn't all these things at once, but this one, then that one, then this one, then that one, then this one. And then when you do that, you lose efficiency. Depending on your class and students, a fun thing to do is just to take them on the first day of class and say, okay, what you should do now is count backward by threes from 100. It's so simple, it's stupid, right? There's trivial task. And then say, okay, now do that. Name the fourth letter after A from every number. Okay, try doing those at the same time. Go ahead. So typically what students find is that it's more than twice as slow to do both than to do the one. So you say, you know, sto, devadasat, sedum, yeah, de, and so on, right? And every fourth. So you're constantly going back between counting backwards the numbers and counting forwards in the letters. Try it. It looks easy. Each task is ridiculously easy, but together they're hard. And we can tell students that when you do this, you're losing efficiency. It's not efficient to do two things at once. It's inefficient to do multiple things at once, assuming they both take any of your cognitive load. Students find this fun, actually. I don't know why. But it's fun, but they kind of believe you after this. But they don't completely believe you, so I suggest you also show them some data. And there's a terrific new study that just came out this summer that you can show them. So you can look that up. If you don't have access to it, let me know and I'll just email the study to you. But this is a wonderfully controlled study where they had 2 different sections of the course, kind of like that earlier study. But it wasn't just one section this happened and the other section this happened. Instead, within each section, there were some weeks where the students were allowed to use their laptops and their phones in class, and other weeks when they were told, no, you may not use your laptops and phones in class. And so every student served as their own control. You couldn't just say, well, the students in that section were smarter or something like that when you look at the exam. And then they look at the exam scores. Well, first at their performance on these in-class, like clicker questions, and then on the exam at the end of the set part of the class, and then at the final exam to see how they did. And the in-class questions, there wasn't any difference. So students seemed to be able to answer okay the questions in class, even if devices were allowed. They did worse on the unit exam, that is just the small test, and they did much worse on the final exam in a section where the devices were allowed. So now my question, first of all, just show your students this. Beautifully controlled study in my view. The thing that's interesting then, and you can ask your students this too, why did they do worse on the exam? Was it because they were using their device? Or because other people's devices were distracting them? So in other words, which one of these 2 did worse on the exam? The one with the laptop or the one next to him? So what do you guys think? Discuss with your table mates. All right, ready? Choose a card, but don't hold it up yet. 3, 2, 1, vote. Oh, look at that. All three were chosen, though. I've got an A. They haven't decided yet, but we've got an A, B, and a C. C is the right answer, actually. Here's the data. If you break it up, so then they ask the students, well, did you use your device? Because, of course, even when it was allowed, some students didn't use it. And so they asked them, and there was no difference in terms of the decrement in performance. The decrease in performance occurred in both sets of students. So this is consistent with other data, which show that even having a device near you tends to pull down your grade. And I always tell my students, even before this study was published, I said, when you're using your phone, you're like creating a vortex of failure around yourself and sucking everyone's performance down around you. So sometimes that helps because they think, well, it's my right to have this phone, but if I'm actually hurting other people, maybe I'll use it less or put it away. So I'm interested, there are some classrooms in the United States where the instructor says you can't use a device. Do those policies exist here? If people say you can't take notes on a laptop, does anybody ever do that? No? I'm just curious as to what people's policies are, because this is a big argument.
Can I ask you, if you have the same results if you allow or not allow, for example, books? I read a lot of books during my school.
What do you think? Would that be just as distracting? I bet they wouldn't be as distracting to others to have a book because, right, a phone is designed to distract you, to distract. That's its purpose, and that's what the engineers who make them are trying to do, is to get your attention. But I imagine it would still pull down your own performance a little. Maybe not yours, but maybe on average it pulled it down. That'd be interesting. Be interesting to find out. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if these appliances would be used for learning situations, like, you know, mobile for finding out data.
Exactly.
Playing with the statistics.
That's part of what me and my colleagues fight about is, you know, should you get rid of devices in your class? Should you use devices in class, you know, so that the students are in fact finding data for them? And I think there's no one right answer to that. But if the students aren't using them for learning, maybe we should discourage them from having them out. And maybe data is one way, and I'll show you another possibility in a minute. Another thing to tell students, so one thing is, look, your phone is distracting you, and we all think that we're an exception to every rule, right? That's one of those psychological, that everyone thinks that psychological truths don't apply to them. So I'm not distracted by my phone, but maybe this helps a little bit in showing them that they might be distracting people around them. Another thing that students might not know is that you can get better performance on exams if you take your notes by hand. And this is not particularly true of, again, facts. It doesn't matter whether you wrote them down by hand or took notes on your laptop. But for conceptual questions, it's better to take notes by hand. Some more work has been done on this and shown that the reason this is true is that you can, if Dan's typing everything I'm saying, he doesn't have to think about it, right? He's just typing everything I'm saying. But you can't write that fast with your hand, so you have to sort of reorganize and summarize the information and think about it as you're going to decide what's important. So that's one way to do it. So this study actually has an extension where they said, well, if the reason that people don't learn that well when they're taking notes on their laptop is because they're taking verbatim notes, that is, they're just writing down every word the instructor says, then all we have to do is tell the students, don't write down every word I say, just summarize, just take the important points. So they tried that. They trained students in summarizing and not writing down every word, and it didn't actually make any difference. So isn't that a great illustration of life in the classroom? That even in this intervention group where they had told students, now don't write everything down, just summarize, their conceptual performance was just as bad as in the other laptop group. So it seems you can't really convince people not to write down sort of too much when they're taking notes with a laptop. So this is useful to tell students, and again, I would say at my university it's quite popular. When you tell students that, they're like, I know, Dr. So-and-so told us. So they're usually familiar with that, that concept from being told many times. I want to give you one more possibility for devices, and maybe this is more acceptable in some contexts than others. But what I do in my large-ish physiology classes, about 95 students, is along the side of the room, I just have a piece of paper with everybody's name on it. And when they come in the room, they put their phone down on their name, and then they go sit with their team. That was a picture taken last week in my class. And I tell them, if they do that, they get this tiny amount of extra credit, basically, toward one of their exam scores. It's not very much credit, but students generally don't mind as long as it's something. And then at the end of the semester, so I did this first in the spring semester, and I asked them, what do you think? Did this change the behavior at all of people in the class? And so most of my students responded to the survey. So purple means they strongly agree with the statement, and green that they agree. So they agreed that their students spent less time on the phone in class than they would have in another class. And that they themselves, so orange is neutral because some of them said, well, I would never have my phone out in any course. But the others said, yeah, I spent less time on my phone in your course than in these other courses because I chose to get that credit for putting it away. And this is the one I thought was really interesting. I said, is it true that you ever miss anything when you're on your phone, that you actually are losing any learning opportunities? And again, you can see that most of them said, yeah, I do sometimes miss something. I think this is funny because then I'm like, well, why would you ever have it out? But of course they do anyway. So almost all of them agreed that there was some cost to having their phone. And I said, what about other students? And the choices were different for this one. Blue is never. So 8.5% of the students said, no, I'm never distracted by other students' phones. But all the other students agreed that at least occasionally, up through usually and almost always and always, they were distracted by other students' phones. I gave students some other opportunity to free write responses about the policy. Of course, they were in favor of it because it raised their grade a little bit in the class. But they also said it was the best positive incentive to put their phone down that they'd seen. So I really don't think this is necessarily the solution for every course. I mean, especially you mentioned, especially if you're using the phone in the course, right? But I think it's worth thinking about having a conversation with your students about their phones, whatever it is. Showing them the data, considering a policy, whatever it is, it's something that's worth talking to them about because it is affecting their learning in your class. Okay, so it's one thing to realize that your phone may be distracting you and preventing you from learning, but it's actually a completely different thing to actually give students tools to reflect. How can we teach them this sort of lost art of reflecting, of having this time when you're not, when you don't have a distracting toy in your hand all the time? Probably not too many of you that read this science article that was talking about how hard it is people find to have nothing to do. Because it's so rare now to have nothing to do because you always have your phone. But you may have seen this headline. This is from about 2.5 years ago. They put people, this is the same study, but this is the headline version of it, where they put people in a room and the only activity that was available to the people was to give themselves electric shocks. And they did. Especially the men. Sorry, guys. And actually, they had done a study showing that people said, I would pay money not to be shocked. Like, they'd used the shock machine, and people said, no, this is terrible. And then they put them in this room, and they shocked themselves, because it was better than nothing. So when you think about that, there are the people in this study, and I think many humans, have trouble being alone with their thoughts. What is this time that we have? So now, a new sort of trend in pedagogy in some places in teaching is to actually train our students to be reflective. And there are various ways to do this. I'm just going to give you a couple brief possibilities. And the one I'm really not going to talk about too much at all, except to mention it here, is contemplative reading. And this is a kind of reading assignment where you tell students, go read this thing, and then monitor your own reaction to the reading. Sometimes in contemplative reading, you read the same little thing, the same poem or the little passage like 10 times until it's sort of like a mantra that you're repeating. And you think about it in a different way after this time. There's many different mechanisms for this. It's especially useful when your students need to read something that was written a long time ago, because they have a hard time believing that, like, Jan Hus or somebody was like a real person, right? Like, wow, that's a long time ago. It's not even like a human. And it helps this contemplative reading with seeing that person as the writer as a real person. I'm going to give you an example of reflective writing in a minute. And some, again, in the US and Canada, at least, teachers are now actually, both in the children's, like the kindergarten through 12th grade system, and at the university level, are actually taking the first 2 or 3 minutes of class and teaching their students to meditate. I don't know how it is in the Czech Republic, you'll have to tell me, but meditation in the US has gone from like 10 years ago, weird people meditated, like weird people, and now it's like going to the gym. It's just like something you do for your health. So things have changed, and this has become a little more acceptable than it would have been even a few years ago. All right, I'm going to give you an example of reflective writing from my friend Don Snyder, who teaches media studies at my university. And what he does is he tells the students, I want you to go in a room with nothing except this reading and a piece of paper and a pencil. You can't have your phone, you can't have a computer, you can't have anything to eat. You're just in there, you're reading this article, and you're writing out by hand your response. And the article was about how our phones sort of affect our lives and things like that. So it itself was about this idea of how we have lost our ability to reflect and so on. So he had them do this, and the students found it really difficult. That was the first thing that Don reported, was the students found this super hard. But then they were fascinated by how hard they found it. And this is just one person's. I'm taking the quotes out because it's hard to read the handwriting. And so what this one student said is, when I find myself constantly checking my phone, she said, I realize, right, the power that my phone has over me. And again, phones are sort of designed to control you in a way. So the fact that she thought about that, I think was interesting. And then later in the same page, she said, I find I take my phone even to the bathroom, and I go through this cycle, and I think many of us will recognize this either in our children or family members or in ourselves, that we too go through these cycles where whatever it is you check, your email, your Facebook, your whatever, and then you sort of go back around again and check them again in that order. And you don't even think that you're doing it, but she noticed it after thinking about her own phone use and so on. I don't mean to say that everything's about phones. There's other issues with reflection and so on in society, but it was an interesting task for students to have to do. Okay, last thing is something that I do with my students. And this is something that I do because when I teach students about a system, like the respiratory system or urinary system or something like that, I find that they always can tell me what's happening in a given piece of the system, but they don't have a sort of big picture view of it. And the other thing is interesting is we can learn about kidneys without them ever once thinking throughout that entire like 3-week period that they have kidneys, right? That they're a person with kidneys. So what I do is take them through what, I don't call it this in class, I call them physiology inside out exercises, but it's really a guided meditation where I tell them to close their eyes, and I actually go into another sort of side room so they can't see me and aren't tempted to look at me, but they can still hear me because I have a mic. And I say, close your eyes, and now picture the oxygen molecules in the air, and I take the oxygen molecule all the way into their alveolus, through all the different layers, and then into their bloodstream, and where is it going, into the muscle, and how does the muscle use it, and then there's carbon dioxide, and where does that come, and so on. So kind of the whole cycle of respiration, and I post them online on SoundCloud, which is free up to a certain point, and I'm not anywhere near close to that point. And then we also do short versions at the start of class. So at the very beginning, the first day when we're doing the respiratory system, I just say, okay, close your eyes for a minute, and I shut off the lights, and we just go through it for 2 or 3 minutes. And I find that the main effect, I mean, hopefully it does give them that big picture and remind them that they have lungs, but really the main effect is just to sort of bring them into the room. That is, right, everything that's going on in their life. They're thinking about their other classes and their girlfriend and their sick mom and their dog and whatever, right? Everything that's going on in their life, it just brings them mentally into the space of that room. And so I find it's worth the 2 or 3 minutes that I spend to do that. I didn't hook up the audio to this, but if you want to hear one afterwards, I've got the audio on there, or I can send a link as an example of that. I think overall, there's a lot of things I could have shown you, and I just had a short period of time to do it. So there's really a lot of possibilities. But the goal is to change the way that students think about their own thinking and their own behaviors, and then ultimately their own learning. And I really want my students to think about learning differently, and specifically to think about it as not something that happens to them, like they sit there and learning falls on them, but something that they're creating. And that's the goal that I have for these different activities, which was said better by famous people a long time ago. If you want to learn more about these kinds of things, I can send you articles and things like that. And then these books are also books that are either about this topic or they just contain some information about it. And these particular books I also just really like because I think they do a good job of describing it.